Sanna Andrew, who's an organiser with the Australian Services Union, is going to chair the meeting, and she'll speak now.
We'll start off with an acknowledgement to country. So we're opening our meeting now, and we're on the Whadjuk Noongar Budja. So we'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this nation. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Noongar lands on which we meet today, Walyalup Budja. We pay our respects to ancestors and elders past and present. We shall be mindful to commit to honouring Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's unique cultural and spiritual relationships to the land, waters and seas, and their rich continuing connection to their lands and contributions to society. And we also thank you, MUA, for the use of these premises, and thank you for coming to open up. Welcome to everyone here today in person and for those who have joined us online. The topic of today's meeting is Anti-Zionism Anti-Semitic? So for those of us who criticise Israel for what is happening in Palestine and for being so-called anti-Zionist, we are accused of being anti-Semitic. The accusation of anti-Semitism is the first line of defence used by defenders of the State of Israel. They say that Israel is a Jewish state and therefore criticism of Israel is slandering of Jews, is being anti-Jew and being anti-Semitic. But critics of Israel, or those of us who are anti-Zionists, argue that the problem is the colonial settler, the political project of Zionism, not the religion of Judaism. So what is the truth of the matter? Is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic? What is the history of anti-Semitism? What connects capitalism and anti-Semitism? This is what our three speakers will address today. So our three speakers are, and we'll start in reverse now because we had Vijay last, but Vijay is going to go first. So we're very proud to have here today and welcome Vijay Prashad. Vijay Prashad is an author, historian, journalist, political commentator and Marxist intellectual. He is the Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, editor of Left Word Books, Chief Correspondent at Globetrotter and a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at the Renmin University of China. Vijay is also the author of 21 books, which is pretty amazing, including most recently The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan and the Fragility of US Power with Noam Chomsky, 2022, and also the book Struggle Makes Us Human, Learning from Movements from Socialism, 2022. Then we will have, hopefully, Zoe Alexandra, who works at the Global Dispatch and is part of the International Secretariat of the International People's Assembly. Zoe is a Palestine solidarity activist in the United States. And then thirdly, but not least, is Barry Healy from the editorial collective of Red Ant and who also organised today's event. And Barry is a lifelong socialist and has been active in Palestine solidarity for over 50 years. There will be some time for questions and answers, I'm assuming at the end of the three speeches or talks. So thank you, Barry. Thank you, Vijay. If you'd like to hit go.
Okay, thanks a lot for chairing the session, and thanks a lot to Red Ant. I think it's important to also acknowledge that the development of a project like Red Ant is very significant. Very large part of the world, Australia, at least territorially, generally what I consider the appendage of Asia. I don't know how continents get divided up, what the logic of that is, but certainly there's a historical link between Australia and the rest of Asia. And I'm very happy that Red Ant is building a project on the lands of Australia, a socialist project, a left project, a project linked to the struggles taking place around the world, including the struggle in Palestine. And I'm very glad that this issue is being raised by good, sensitive people in Australia because it's such a horrendous situation. I'm going to make three sorts of remarks about three different concepts, really, or three different approaches to this problem. Number one, I want to do a little work thinking about the concept of anti-Semitism, then the concept of anti-Zionism, and thirdly, the concept of repulsion. And the third is, I think, something that is not on the flyer, but I think is pretty important at this time. So let's start with the first. Anti-Semitism is an actual ideology. It's real. It's a species of racism. It has existed on the European continent, where it has its provenance for a very long time. You can trace modern anti-Semitism back to the Inquisition in Spain, after the reconquest of Spain by the Catholic kings, the expulsion of the so-called Moors, the Muslims of the Andalusian part of Spain, the provision against Jews. Jews had to convert or leave, and so on. This is, of course, a part of Spain, Andalusia, that produced some of the most startling thinkers of that period, the period before the 1400s. People like Moses Maimonides, people like Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, people who were intellectuals of the Mediterranean. But the Reconquista and then the Inquisition was an inquisition not only against Muslims, which is to a large extent well known, but also an inquisition against Jews. And that seam of anti-Semitism, which had a ferocious role in Northern Europe, all the way from the Low Countries right into the heart of Muscovy, that seam of anti-Semitism, in a sense, produces its really ghastly history, mostly in the states that form Germany. In the time of the formation of Germany after Bismarck, there was a great debate that took place in these German states called the Judenfrage, where people actually debated, could you be at the same time a Jew and German? That is a repulsive way to frame nationality, but that's indeed how high philosophers of Germany framed it. I'm saying all this because I want to amplify the fact that anti-Semitism is a European problem. It's a European form of racism. There was no anti-Semitism in Baghdad, where Jews, Muslims, Christians lived in a kind of conviviality. There was no anti-Semitism in Palestine, in Jerusalem, in Damascus, in Beirut, in Cairo. That ideology was not known. It didn't grow there. It wasn't from there. It's not native to those parts of the world. Indeed, right up till the 1940s, we talked of Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Jews, not anti-Semitism. It was simply not an ideology of the Arab world or of Asia in general. Anti-Semitism was unknown in a country like India, where there were Baghdadi Jews in some quite considerable numbers, in cities like Calcutta, where I was born, or in Mumbai. It was not a familiar theme, this questioning of whether Jews can live in your society. But this was a German problem. It was, to an extent, it was a broad European problem. And I think that's important, because why I'm amplifying this is that till today, Europeans have not come to terms with their own ugly history of anti-Semitism. And rather than come to terms with their own history of anti-Semitism, they're trying to displace it onto other people, claiming that, for instance, Palestinians might be anti-Semitic, or people who criticize Israel are anti-Semitic, when in fact anti-Semitism is their problem. It is a strange thing to watch the German government police the contours of anti-Semitism today. Germany, which has never really come to terms with its own history, never really taught its own history to its own people, not only about the Holocaust against the Jews from in the 1940s, but the genocide of the Herero and Namikwa people in Southwest Africa. Has never come to terms with its colonial history, the role it has played in the destruction of large parts of humanity, the annihilation, indeed, of the Namikwa and Herero people. So that's the concept of anti-Semitism. It's real, it's European, it's not anybody else's history. And it's a strange thing to watch Europeans use that term to silence others. It is a form of racialism or racism. That's the first category. The second category is anti-Zionism. Now, Zionism is interesting because Zionism is in fact a species of Germanic nationalism, a German form of nationalism. If you go and read the great texts of German nationalism of the 19th century, much of it really refracted in the work of Ranke, the historian, the so-called father of history, in Herder and people like that. You get this idea of nationalism as one people, ein Volk, one language, one religion. This idea that nationalism has to be what was known in Germany as blood and soil nationalism, territory and race. That form of nationalism, which is again alien to the anti-colonial struggles. For instance, in Ghana or in India, anti-colonial nationalism wasn't one people, one language, one territory. Yes, of course, one territory, but not one people, because most anti-colonial nationalisms, because of the nature of colonial territory formation, were multinational. In India, for instance, there were multinational formations inside the Project for Freedom, so that there were people speaking Bengali or people speaking Tamil, people speaking Andhra, people speaking Marathi, many languages, many peoples, different ethnicities, and so on. Certainly one territory. It was a territorial form of nationalism, seeking sovereignty for the territory, but not ein Volk, one people, one language, and so on. That is a precisely Germanic form of nationalism, which really envelops a lot of European countries. France, one language, one religion, one territory. And in that sense, Zionism, which is a very much a European formation, Theodor Herzl and others were European intellectuals. These European intellectuals constructed what they thought of as a Jewish state, which was directly in the theoretical arsenal of people like Herder. One language, whether it was going to be Yiddish or Hebrew, as it later in 1948 was Hebrew, one language, one people, the Jewish people, and then one territory. And after the Balfour Declaration of 1916, that slice of land somewhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. That's Zionism. It's a political ideology. It has nothing to do precisely with the Jewish religion. It has to do with the Jewish people, in the sense that German nationalism has to do with the German people, or French nationalism has to do with the French people. There is a ethno-religious component to it. Remember, one people, one language, in many cases, one religion and one territory. This is an ethno-nationalist political project. That's what Zionism is. In fact, early Zionists were not going to create their territory or their nation in that part of the land, the Levantine area of the Mediterranean. Initially, they were thinking of doing this somewhere in Africa, but that didn't come through. And so then after the Balfour Declaration in 1916, British basically said, why don't you just take this land? Doesn't matter that Palestinians live there, you can just take it over. That's Zionism. It's a political project. Now, being opposed to a political project is a perfectly appropriate thing. I mean, you can be opposed to all kinds of political projects. That's the nature of politics. There's nothing offensive by itself, by its merits of being against a political project. In fact, when Herzl proposed the idea of a land between, later between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, the Jewish state, as Herzl called it in his book, at the time, many Jews rejected what Herzl was doing. They said, they made the argument that the Jewish project is in the diaspora. That's the point. In the diaspora, Jews will have their practice of maintaining community, maintaining their customs, and so on. There was a debate inside the community. But I think it's appropriate to have a debate, from anywhere. I mean, about 10 years ago, the UN Economic Commission of West Asia published a very important report studying the status of countries in the Middle East. And the UN report said 2 countries in the Middle East have to really think hard about their form of nation state. And those 2 countries have an ethno-religious national project. This goes against the norms of democracy. And the UN pointed to 2 states. One was Saudi Arabia, and the other is Israel. Israel was so upset by this assessment by the UN that they got the head of that office in Beirut, Rima Khaled, they got her removed from office. I mean, it was extraordinary. They were so upset by just that. And that's actually a pretty straightforward criticism. Imagine tomorrow if the right wing in Australia, maybe even just the center, decides that Australia is a country of white people who are descended from Europe, only white people. It is a country where you have to speak English, and it is a country where you have to be an Anglican, not anything, not even just a Christian, but an Anglican. That's the limit, and then the whole territory, and then everybody else is a second-class citizen. Now, you could turn back to me and say that is indeed already the case. That indeed there is a kind of de facto white Anglican, sort of project already in place. The very impressive Australian anthropologist Ghassan Hadj wrote a book about this, White Australia. And by the way, Ghassan Hadj was recently fired by the Max Planck Institute in Germany because of Facebook posts that he had written criticizing the war that the Israelis are conducting. Ghassan Hadj is an Australian national of Lebanese descent, born in Beirut, Lebanon, taken a fellowship at the Max Planck Institute, from which he was fired. Why? Because he raised these questions about the war. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But Ghassan has written a number of books making the case that de facto, Australia suffers from some of these ethno-religious problems as well. But in Israel, it's not a de facto issue, it's de jure. That anybody who is not Jewish, who is not, sort of from, who's also, there's an issue of practicing the religion and so on. If you're not Jewish, you are a second-class citizen in Israel. And that's the reason why number of UN reports, but also Human Rights Watch and others have said there is apartheid in Israel. The designation of apartheid is actually a technical designation. It's not based on rhetoric. It's not a rhetorical thing. People saying apartheid or fascist, I can see how people use these terms rhetorically. They say, oh, they are fascist, or they are this or that. How people talk. But in fact, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Amnesty International, several UN special rapporteurs, they specifically say apartheid on a definitional ground. Because in Israel, definitionally, there is a distinction made between those who are Jewish and those who are not. And that comes out of this ethno-religious history of the construction of Zionism. So it's perfectly acceptable to be critical of a political project that's ethno-religious. You can be critical of the Hindutva project in India, an ethno-religious project. You can be critical of the government of Saudi Arabia, which prosecutes an ethno-religious project, and so on. In the same way, discussions around Zionism are principally about ethno-religious projects. There is nothing racist about talking about Zionism and being critical of Zionism. So that's the second concept, as it was, second term that's of importance. And both these terms are on the flyer, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. There's a third area, the area of, let's call it the politics of disgust, the politics of refusal. Look, frankly, in this recent period, much more than in any other prior period, people watching the character of the Israeli attack on the Palestinian people in Gaza, people watching the character of that attack are simply disgusted by what they are seeing. They're disgusted, they're repulsed by what they are seeing. They don't necessarily have any theory of Zionism or any understanding necessarily about the Zionist or anti-Zionist political projects. They might not even have a good understanding of anti-Semitism. What is anti-Semitism? What does it mean? And so on. These are, in a way, very narrow discussions, which are not, they don't necessarily have a mass character. The term anti-Semite can be used politically to silence people, but there's no general understanding of the history of anti-Semitism, its European roots, the way it's been mobilized in the same way, in fact, as other ethno-national types of projects are mobilized. And then very limited understanding in the world of Zionism. When I talk to people about this, they don't really know the history of Zionism and what constitutes anti-Zionism and how these are not things particular to the Jewish state, but in fact, these are related to the problems in different countries, as I said, Australia and so on. The bulk of the people who are reacting very strongly to the events in Gaza are not reacting on the basis of the vectors of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism. They are reacting out of a politics of disgust. They are disgusted by what's happening in the world. Polling data from country after country shows people bewildered why there's not a ceasefire. There's just insufficient understanding out there about why the Israelis are behaving like this, why the West, including the government of Australia, is fully backing the Israelis as they prosecute this, why nobody can stop this. I think this disgust and bewilderment is, in fact, the majority, it defines the majority of the attitude towards the killing of these 30,000 people. I think that's the main way in which people have entered this process. And so for people who are struck by the politics of disgust, the politics of bewilderment, it's confusing to be told that you are anti-Semitic for merely saying, I want a ceasefire. It's confusing for people to be called anti-Semitic merely for saying, I don't want to see this kind of violence meted out against the people. And then when the International Court of Justice says plausible evidence of genocide, I think it's confusing for lots of people to see that ruling dismissed by the Israeli government, mocked, in fact, by the Israeli government. And I think that for those of us who are very much invested in a kind of politics of sensitivity, we don't want to see people harmed in such a horrible way as the Palestinians are experiencing. We believe fundamentally in the right of people to exercise their humanity, to exercise dignity, to live as people equivalent to other people. We have to take seriously the fact that most people simply just don't get a sense of what these debates are. And I think what tends to happen is hardcore activists online particularly debate these things as if this is what frames this conflict. Is it really a debate about is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and so on, when most people don't even have a sense of that debate because they are at another place. They are perplexed by the international division of humanity that seems to be operating here. I travel a fair bit, was recently in Accra in Ghana, where people talk very openly saying, it's because they're not white that they get treated like this. When the attack took place on Ukraine, all the doors opened for Ukrainians to come as refugees. They got jobs, they got apartments and so on. Nothing like that was made available to the Afghans after the United States retreated from Afghanistan and so on. Nothing was like that for the Palestinians. In fact, the doors to aid have been shut. And, you've all seen scenes of these airdrops of food falling into the Mediterranean, killing people as have been killed just yesterday. 3-4 people died when the parachutes didn't open and the big crates fell on people. This is in fact what is most gripping for people, this sense of the politics of disgust at what's happening and the politics of bewilderment. And I've been trying very hard to think, how do we, as people who are committed to the freedom of the Palestinians, as socialists and so on, how do we produce our own language and debates on these issues? And when we are attacked as anti-Semites, is it actually valuable for us to take that debate on? Is that a useful debate, or are there other things that we should be doing? From my perspective, and I've faced this kind of attacked for a long time, for several years. People have tried to get me fired from jobs and so on. But for me, this is not significant. This attack at us, calling us anti-Semites, it's not significant. And we should not let that take over so much of our energy and our brains. I think that they are trapping us into a debate which we don't need to be trapped into, because there are masses of people that we need to be reaching out to now with a much more sincere and sensitive posture. We should not be out there being trapped into a debate which brings us into their terms, where when we say things like, no, I'm not an anti-Semite, you sound ridiculous. You know, I don't want to be out there having to defend myself against somebody who's attacking me on this ground. I would like to talk to a much broader group of people who are represented by the politics of disgust and the politics of bewilderment. They need us. They need us there where they are. They don't need us to be stuck talking to some trolls here and there, or the Hasbara groups from the Israeli state that come in here deliberately to suck our energy into their debate. I don't need their debate. In fact, forthrightly, we need to say, anti-Semitism is not my problem. It is Europe's problem. Chancellor Olaf Scholz should be making speech upon speech every day to apologize for what Germany has done to the Jewish people over the last, few hundred years. That's what should be the obligation, not for me. Not for me. We need to set the terms of our own discussion and our own debate. So, comrades, what I would say is, turn our backs on some of these debates. Don't let them bother us. Don't let them sink us, our confidence, by these attacks. We have to go forward to the masses of people and talk to them about what they are feeling. And they're feeling disgusted. They are feeling bewildered. They need us. They don't need us to be talking to the margin, the dangerous Hasbara margin that attempts to trap us into their debate. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Vijay, would you like to go straight to question and answer just with yourself, and following that I speak? Or would you, because we're kind of, the revolutionary vanguard here in Australia wants to know that you get a good night's sleep, right? So speak now or forever hold your breath. Would you, no, you can't hold your breath, right? I've never known anyone who can speak off the top of his head the way you do, mate. So would you like to go straight to question and answer? We will just pepper you with questions, you answer. Or would you be willing to hear my presentation and then we do it jointly?
You've actually put me in a difficult position, because I would, of course, like to hear your presentation, but I would also like to not be awake for the next hour and a half. So I'm in a difficult position. And since we are all Asians and extraordinarily polite people, it's very difficult to for me to directly say anything. So let me just put it like this. I'll be guided by you.
Oh, you'll be guided by me. Okay. And that's great. Oh, good. So you're a Bolshevik militant and you will submit to party discipline. I dictate that you should go to bed. No, but only after you've answered a few questions. So we have some, maybe if you speak and then I'll just repeat it for Vijay.
Well, was going to the United States, wonderful political positions can be found. What do you make of the recent uprising of anti-Semitic pro-Zionist positions? Not just from Christian fundamentalists, like most makes sense, but people like Musk, very pro-Zionist but very anti-Semitic at the same time. What do you make of that?
Okay, Vijay, the question is, what do you make of the sort of confusing confluence of anti-Zionism and, I should say, pro-Zionist anti-Semitism in the United States? and not just from the Christian fundamentalists who want to see the return of Jesus, but also people like, well, Donald Trump and Musk. So do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's you've answered part of the question, because the terms of the confluence of pro-Zionism and anti-Semitism are, of course, set by Christian fundamentalists. They set those terms, and indeed they share this with very orthodox religious Jews in Israel, who believe that they should destroy the Al-Aqsa temple, the mosque, and build the Temple Mount. From the mount, build the giant second temple in Jerusalem. This is a view held by many Orthodox religious Muslim Jews inside Israel, and they share it with the Christian fundamentalists. The Christian fundamentalists, of course, go further than the Jewish wish to build the second temple, because the Christian fundamentalists say, once the second temple is built, God will kill all the Jews and lift the Christians to heaven. I mean, that's what makes that Christian Zionism anti-Semitic, because in fact, they are calling for the death of all Jews. And James Healy, for instance, the Reverend in the United States, big, very influential religious figure who spoke at the pro-Israel rally in Washington, D.C., is openly talked about this, the death of the Jews so that Christians can rise up to heaven. So that sets the term for some of this, the mass base, as it were, for this Christian Zionism, this Christian anti-Semitic Zionism. That's the mass base. That's the millions of people who adopt that position. It's not just in the United States. It's in Brazil. It's in several other countries where the evangelical movement has really picked up steam. Bolsonaro's, pro-Israel politics are rooted in that Christian anti-Semitic Zionism. Javier Milei of Argentina, his pro-Israel position is rooted in that Christian anti-Semitic Zionism. I mean, I think that for people like Donald Trump, and it's very hard to figure out Elon Musk. Okay, I don't want to even try to analyze Elon Musk's thinking. This is a child of South African apartheid, who has the most confused understanding of the world. One minute he's talking about Marx, the next minute, he's in space. I mean, he is a confused boy, and I don't really get it. So I don't presume to, but I know that seam of thinking, that includes Donald Trump. That seam of thinking is interesting because one level of it is pure opportunism. They are opportunistic. They want to capitalize on this mass base of Christian anti-Semitic Zionists. But another side of it finds an appeal in what we used to call gun Zionism. When Ariel Sharon appears on the scene in the 1970s in Likud politics, you have a new species of Zionism get calcified. It was there earlier, 1948 and so on, that the Zionists must have a gun, must always protect themselves from danger. We don't want the Holocaust again, so we'll be muscular in our defense of our Israel and so on. But from the 1970s, when Sharon enters Likud as the Minister of Agriculture and so on, from that point onwards, Barry, what you begin to see, which is interesting, is this kind of idea that Israel will defend itself and will also defend the West inside the Middle East. It will be, in a sense, an aircraft carrier for the West in the Middle East. It will be the gendarme of the West in the Middle East. And after the Iranian Revolution, when before that, Iran played this role for the West, was an anchor of Western interests. The Shah of Iran played this role. After 1979, when Iran was not available, Israel, in that gun Zionism, becomes so important for US interests in the Middle East, for intelligence, for maintaining a kind of order and so on amongst the Arab states, disciplining some countries, Jordan, Egypt, and to some extent Syria. And that's what is appealing to Trump. When you hear Trump talk about Israel, it's like Israel can kick ass. The Israeli military is like an advanced detachment of the US Marines. And by the way, that's not a silly thing to say, because there's a large number of US citizens that operate inside the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. Very large number of US citizens are border guards in the West Bank and so on. So we have to start very much thinking about the Israeli project and the US project as being very much intertwined. They're not so far removed from each other. You know, in Australia, you are familiar because of Pine Gap with the Five Eyes intelligence network. It's no longer Five Eyes, as you know. It used to be New Zealand, Australia, Britain, Canada, the United States. Those were the Five Eyes. But now it's 14 Eyes, including Israel. You know, Israel participates in the whole Pine Gap project. They get the intelligence that is absorbed at that big station, that listening station in Australia. It's all linked up now. So this muscular fascination with the Israeli military, with Israeli military technology, Australia buys surveillance equipment from Israel. All of this stuff is, I think, one of the reasons why men like Trump, you know, let's bomb them, mother of all bombs and so on. There's an affinity they have to the generals and the kind of military complex of Israel, a military plus startup. There was a ridiculous book about Israel called Startup Nation. You know, it's a country of entrepreneurs, of high tech and so on. It's actually not true. The book is a facade. It was part of a kind of intelligence operation, a Hasbara operation. But you know this idea that lingers in people's minds, that Israel is a country with lots of little high-tech firms that are innovating and so on. And that combination of small high-tech firms and the military, that appeals to men like Trump, and perhaps because of the high-tech thing to men like Musk, this appeals to them. And you know, I don't even need to go into the fear of Muslims, hatred of Muslims, and all of that. Let's even leave that aside. The positive ramifications of the existence of Israel, number one, this, you know, Christian anti-Semitic Zionism, which provides a mass base, and then this fascination, this affinity with the muscular character of the Israeli state, the combination of technology and violence appeals to men like Trump. And I don't think we should underestimate that combination of violence and technology. You know, that's how they want to frame the world today. Use violence and technology, drone warfare, you know, snooping on your phone and so on. That combination, it appeals to these guys.
Sorry, Vijay. So I really appreciate. I get bogged down with the kind of debate that you seem to be saying we shouldn't be getting bogged down in, which I really understand. I understand that we want a mass political movement rather than get bogged down in just stupid, stale debates. So I totally understand it, but I also feel like we tend to get brought into them specifically because we also simultaneously realize that large consensus is already existent and produces nothing. Netanyahu is laughing, and when we know that, and we're like, okay, so what can we do? And the reason why I think we get bogged down into that debate is it's an extension of saying we need to get bogged down into that debate because it's essentially saying fascism is wrong, and we're fighting the Musks, the Trumps, the people who, like what you were just saying now, have an appeal for the strongman, which, you know, is reflected in the Zionist view of seeing the Jewish diaspora as the weak Jew, which is bad, you know, whereas we, and the consensus around the world is we want to stand with victims. We believe in, you know, in humanism, and we believe in the UN, and we believe in all this stuff, which is now just proved to be a whole sham. And in fact, it's imperialism all the way down. My question is, what do you suggest the politics of repulsion? What do we get from that? Where do we go with it, you know?
Yeah, so here's the interesting thing, is I actually don't agree that Netanyahu is laughing all the way. I think the global protest movement has put a lot of pressure on the Israeli high officials. You know, Isaac Herzog is going to go to the Netherlands, and he is going to face people yelling and screaming, war criminal, wherever he goes. US high officials, Kirsten Gillibrand, Jared Kushner is not a high official, but all these people try to stand up and speak and young people get up one by one and yell, ceasefire now, you are complicit in genocide. Aaron Bushnell's death has also chilled people in different quarters of the world. 2 million people on the streets of Istanbul. Yes, they were flying Turkish flags, not Palestinian flags. It was like a rally for Erdogan rather than for Palestine, but they were chanting free Palestine. There's a lot of pressure on the Israelis. And I think there's a lot of pressure on the high officials of the West. And they find that they are losing large sections of their own population. So we are having an enormous impact. And I would really like us also not to surrender to their view, which is that Netanyahu doesn't care. He cares. And you know, one of the things that the Israelis are saying now is the reason this government is refusing to stop the barrage is because they feel that if the barrage stops, the music stops, there's no chair for Netanyahu. He needs the music to continue. The musical chair's music cannot go off because then the political recriminations will start in Israel at a higher level. So there's a cynical way in which they are continuing to prosecute this war, killing people even today and so on. We are having a big impact. I would not concede that we are not. Now, the question is, of course, we are demoralized because today, again, children died and so on. And we feel that by not being able to have a ceasefire, we're not having an impact. But let me say a few things about that. The very fact that South Africa, for instance, Namibia, Bolivia, all these countries have been going to the ICJ, it's a qualitative shift, a real shift, you know, that these countries of the South have been going up there to the ICJ, insisting quite forcefully that what Israel is doing is genocide. The Namibians yelling back to the Germans. This is humiliating for Olaf Scholz to be told by the Namibian president, you forgot about the genocide you did here between 1904 and 1908. All of this is having an enormous impact. I mean, if you look at Sigrid Kaag, the special rapporteur on Gaza, you know, just nominated by the UN recently, her statements are much sharper than I've ever seen. You know, they are talking every day about starvation, famine, things like that. They are not begging for the aid trucks to be allowed in. Today, Naledi Pandor, or yesterday, the South African foreign minister said, if the armies of the region, well-armed people, and she's talking directly to Egypt, just defend the trucks and force their entry into Gaza, she said that would be something. I've never heard language like this before. I mean, in the immediate period, we may not be able to have a ceasefire, but we have won an enormous a majority of people around the world, including their governments. It's the Western governments, including Australia, that are marginal on this. And I understand that you have a particular problem in Australia because you share that settler colonial kind of history where there is an enormous pressure coming from upstairs, right? You know, whoever the high officials are, there's an enormous pressure coming from upstairs because they basically think like Yanks. You know, the high officials of Australia, they might as well be Yankee, you know, high officials. They think in a similar way, right? They have a similar worldview. And I think, you know, as you build your movement in Australia, you will also turn the tide. I mean, let me just say that almost every single day in New York City, there has been a demonstration, shutting down the Brooklyn Bridge, going to the New York Times. It has terrified the officials of New York City. It has terrified them. In the cities of Italy, I don't know if you saw images of the Carabinieri beating up high school students in an alleyway. They are scared. They are losing generations. And the people who are being radicalized now on this issue because they are repulsed by what's happening in Gaza, they are determined to do something. They just won't stop going on the streets. This is not just them. And I think you're right here. They are not just seeing this as pro-Palestine or anti, you know, what the Israeli state is doing, but they are understanding imperialism one way or the other. The US, 3 vetoes in the Security Council over this period. People are beginning to understand what is imperialism. You know, this is coming on the table. I watch some of these young people and the things they are saying on social media. They are disgusted by the world order, mostly the Western world order. You know, I mean, the fact that so many people are voting in this US primary for uncommitted rather than pro-Biden has sent shock waves through the Democratic Party. They are going to lose the election to Trump on this issue. You know, it's not just the Arab American vote that they will lose in Michigan, where it's considerable and so on. They're going to lose the enthusiasm of young people. Yesterday or day before yesterday in California, there was a primary for the Peace and Freedom Party. The candidates from the Party for Socialism and Liberation, Claudia de la Cruz, she bested Cornel West in that primary. You know, and Cornel West is he was in the Matrix, for God's sake. But he was bested by a very young organizer was an openly socialist organizer who won the nomination of Peace and Freedom Party in California. You know, she's in her 30s. And she won it. Why? Because she has been fierce on Palestine. And that draws people. So I don't feel dispirited in this moment. I feel dispirited because I've lost a number of friends in Palestine, people who had lived in their homes in Gaza City, in Khan Yunis, friends, families that I've known are gone, you know, and friends are now sitting in Rafah and so on. It's horrendous. But at the same time, because history moves in a very complicated way, I feel the power of people who are repulsed by what's going on, you know, and they are not allowing us. And that's why I made those comments. I made them a little, perhaps bluntly, but that's why I made those comments that we should not be demoralized by the attacks saying that we are anti-Semitic, which is a false, itself an offensive. It's offensive to call me anti-Semitic. You know, firstly, I come from a country with no history of anti-Semitism, and to be called anti-Semitic by a German institution, Frankfurter Allgemeine wrote an article recently calling me an anti-Semite. For God's sake, man, Frankfurter Allgemeine, you guys participated in the Nazi regime. You know, my family has no fascists in it, okay? And your newspaper was owned by fascists. So for God's sake, man, have some decency. Yeah, but I'm not pissed off by them. I think it's hilarious. I think it's hilarious that a German newspaper decides to call me, somebody from India, an anti-Semite. You know why? Because I have a history since the 1980s of being on the side of the Palestinians. You know, it's insane, right? Insane.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Vijay. Oh, and just to let people know, Vijay was there hammering about imperialism. In April, Red Ant is going to have a series of seminars on the subject of Leninism today, which is going to deal precisely with this issue of imperialism in the world today, what it is not, and how to fight it. So how about we have two more people asking questions. We've got Brendan and Nandini, and following that, we've got Matthew. So Brendan and Nandini.
Hi, can everyone hear us? Awesome. Hi, Vijay. Thanks so much. My name is Nandini, and this is Brendan, and we're part of Red Ant. And I think we are really interested in your kind of tactical viewpoint, and we want to know, like, what do you think are like good kind of strategic talking points when we're speaking to like the Australian, Western, often white audiences to especially to kind of shift their views towards a more global and global imperialist mindset. Like, I think a lot of the politics of outrage and disgust comes from the fact that people don't realize that the kind of horrors that we're seeing in Palestine are also everyday horrors in the global South. And if there's any like particular points that we can use to kind of help shift that outlook, because a lot of the anti-Palestine movement that we've seen in Melbourne, which is where we're from, is often mired in strategies that kind of lack that outlook, and they don't kind of mobilize people along the global mindset. It's very local based, and it's interesting because they kind of struggle to understand like how to then connect Australia to the issue as well. Like there's a bit of a tension. Like we have people talking about like local councils and stuff, which are actually not really that relevant. But Pine Gap, for example, is extremely relevant. So they kind of they don't think it out properly, I think. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just think like the strategic question for us is how do you shift the conversation away from the anti-Semitism issue to this matter of like global imperialism and settler colonialism, right? Because, you know, my sense is, and maybe this isn't true, my sense is that the anti-Semitism discourse is like principally a global north phenomena. You know what I mean? Like you say, Vijay, and I agree with you that it is, you know, anti-Semitism is a European problem. And the discourse that surrounds that is something that I feel sort of takes place exclusively in the imperialist countries for that reason, right?
Yeah.
So it's sort of difficult to navigate away from that question because people are losing their jobs over it. You know, ridiculous shit is happening.
We're not in the position where we can kind of be like, oh yeah, like they obviously don't care about Palestine because they're not white. Like, because a lot of the time we're speaking to white people, like it's just not obvious to them as much as it is to us and other people from the global south.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, Matthew, can you ask your question, please?
I'm also, you know, I've always been sort of fairly pro-Palestine, but I'm fairly new to a lot of the details of the whole ongoing history. And, you know, I've been gradually learning more and more bit by bit as this, you know, disaster has been unfolding. The question I have is sort of about, is sort of on that theme of people like Netanyahu sort of painting themselves into a corner and then continuing the terrible things that they're doing because they've painted themselves into a corner. So it's that sort of a thing. And then there's a broader issue, I guess, about the, you know, I don't know, the bigger picture about what the you know, the bigger long-term solution is for everyone in that area. And there was, I think there's a similarity with the mentality of a lot of, you know, a lot of the slave owner class in the South, you know, and their anxieties about, you know, slavery and the revenge they would suffer for the things that they did. It was their own fault, but nonetheless, it meant that they dug their heels in harder. So I guess, what are we saying to people who might have, I guess, I don't know, they might say, oh, well, what about recriminations against, you know, the Jewish population because the Arab populations felt so angry, or, you know, what sort of, are we having a conversation about constitutional provisions about equal rights for everybody in some sort of a restored Palestine? I mean, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead with that sort of a question, but yeah, I guess that's sort of what my question is like, how do we have a conversation with people about what the long-term conversation is and everyone, you know, being on the right track and getting along going forward after all of the, you know, horrific damage that's been done? I think that question makes sense. I hope it does.
I have actually had the benefit of going over Barry's presentation already, and there is a lot there that you'll chew on, Matthew. I think what I would say is you should sit down and take some notes, because there's a lot there. I mean, just to be honest with you, I've never been to Australia in my whole life, or never even to New Zealand, except through the Lord of the Rings films. And, you know, I would like to come to Australia, and I've been talking to Max Lane about it and so on. But I would like to come before Mitchell Stark retires, because I'd like to see him bowl once live on an Australian ground, because I think he's a pretty extraordinary fast bowler. But anyway, I'm so happy, guys, because India is just destroying England, okay? And I don't know if you follow this, but I have my friends in the rail workers union in England, and I constantly rib each other that I only write to them when India is beating England in a test. I like to write to them on the 4th day of the test when it's a fait accompli and looks like England is going down once more. But anyway, I have the highest respect for the Australian cricket team because those fellows keep winning, and something about the water, or maybe it's a settler colonial thing, guys. I don't know what it is, but that team is ferocious. And soon we'll be saying, just as we say anyone but England, we'll be saying anyone but Australia, but not yet. I'm saying all this because Nandini and Brendan, I don't know your country at all, really. I don't know it. So I don't really know how to say these things to you. What I do know is that because you're now in a collective project, the Red Ant project, I'm sure that these are debates and discussions you'll be having how to formulate the best strategy and tactics within the Red Ant project. I think you've raised a really good question. So I can't specifically come to that, but I want to dance around your question, if that's okay. Okay, but I mean, I just don't even presume to believe that I'm giving you any advice on this. I'm just dancing around the question. Yeah. Again, I'm really happy just to see you guys. And you say, well, we are with Red Ant and so on. And of course, ants don't function one at a time. They come in swarms. So I very much hope that you are out there bringing more people into your colony. Colony being a really inappropriate word for building socialism, but you get the point. You decided on the name Red Ant, not me. And ants do live in colonies. So I don't know what to say about that and why Barry and all, they have to take responsibility for the name. Okay. Now,
all right.
The thing is that when we enter into a political discussion at a time like this, most of the people sensitive, distraught by what's happening, most people are allow themselves to be framed around the concept of ceasefire. They are not actually thinking, Matthew, about what happens the next day. What are the politics, 2-state solution, 3-state. Most people right now are just trapped by the concept of ceasefire. We are going to have Ramadan, what we in South Asia call Ramzan. It's going to start in a few days. The people in Rafah don't have any of the food items for iftar. They are going to go through the month of Ramzan without a proper way to actually hold Ramzan. And if you know anything about Ramzan, and all Palestinians aren't Muslims, but the majority are. If you know anything about Ramadan or Ramzan, it's in fact a month of celebration. It's joy. It's not a month of deprivation. It's a complete misunderstanding of fasting. Fasting is not about deprivation. Fasting is about the joy of being together, of having collective meditation and experience. And it's about joy. Families and friends getting together to break the fast collectively. It's not about me fasting and then me eating in the bathroom later. It's a collective process. It's about building the love of community and so on. And it's kind of a mystical but this is disallowed this month to the people of Gaza. And so the question of ceasefire is in fact the dominant question. And I feel right now, for people around the world, the slogan of ceasefire now is adequate. You don't actually have to get into that. And in fact, by the way, on the question of anti-Semitism, this is a very powerful way to have the debate and dialogue. Because in fact, the people who are calling us anti-Semites are against peace. And that's what one has to use to build the majorities, to say that we are the ones who are calling for peace. We are calling for peace in Ukraine. We are calling for peace in Gaza against the Palestinians. And then the day after, you can have a debate about, ending the occupation and so on. I know it's important even now to say ceasefire, end the occupation, right? As two twin slogans. But what most people will fix on is ceasefire now. End the occupation is much more complicated, and it requires, as Matthew has said, requires a lot more understanding of the issues. And also, frankly, this is an issue for the Israelis and the Palestinians to sort out, not for the Australians to intervene. It's a little bit like when George Galloway was elected MP from Rochdale, the BBC reporter says to him, "Do you think it's appropriate for Hamas to be in the government?" And, Galloway says that's such an imperialist question. That's for them. If the Palestinians want to elect them, they go ahead and elect them. I mean, frankly, listen, I would like to intervene in the British elections. And I would like to say, don't be idiotic. Don't vote for the idiot Keir Starmer and the idiot Rishi Sunak. Vote for a third alternative. Vote for whatever. I mean, why doesn't the Scottish National Party run candidates in England? Or Sinn Féin, for God's sake, let's try something different. You get the point, you know. The point is that we are not actually interfering in British politics. Why should they interfere here? In fact, my friend, the Palestinians have many proposals on the table, you know, to discuss and negotiate the way forward. But you see, we are always dragged into their frame of debate. For instance, I will go out there and chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine must be free." And they say, "Oh, that's anti-Semitic." But how is that anti-Semitic? Frankly, that is the policy today of the Israeli government. They want from the river, the Jordan River, to the Mediterranean Sea. They are trying to erase all the Palestinians. What the phrase "from the river to the sea," what it implies is the creation of a secular democratic state, all the land. We have to just directly not be scared about somebody says, "Oh, that's an anti-Semitic phrase." You have to be brave and say that's not an anti-Semitic phrase. In fact, it is already the established policy of the Israeli government, but with an apartheid lens. We want to create a post-apartheid "from the river to the sea." We want Israel to have its 1994, like South Africa. You have to be bold in the face of these attacks. Listen, Nandini, I cannot advise anybody about their jobs. Politics is risky, and these things happen. And you know, we are dealing with an extremely vicious bloc. You know, the from the neoliberals to the right, these are vicious, nasty people. You know, they will come after us with all instruments. I was watching a little clip today. These young, sweet people working for YouTube Music, small group of them in Austin, Texas, formed a union. Okay. They came before. We have the video of this because this young man comes before the Austin City Council in Texas, because that's where YouTube Music is based, to talk about, you know, how they've unionized it. While he was talking to the city council, a young comrade of his comes up to him and interrupts him and speaks into the mic and says, "We've just all been fired." These are vicious, and I'm sorry to use this word on this platform, but what the hell? These are vicious bastards. You know, they would scorch earth on our destiny. They would scorch earth on our destiny, and we have to be brave in fighting them. You can't protect your jobs sometimes. Sometimes you have to risk it in the fight. These young people risked their jobs and they were all fired. You know, it's very difficult. We can't have it both ways. We have to be courageous and brave. And you know, we have to take care of each other. We have to have the correct tactics and strategy. I was very upset when I watched the video of Aaron Bushnell. I was very upset watching that, because that's a person who could have become a very important comrade in our broad struggle to transform the world. We do not celebrate that kind of outcome for a young person's life. It didn't bring me any joy, none. You know, I don't come from a tradition of martyrdom. You know, even if there is an armed struggle, you have to cry when every one of our comrades falls on the field. We are not proud of that. We are not happy. We don't. That's not our religion. We are sorrowful for the loss of anybody, but we still have to be brave, because we're dealing with people who are nasty and vicious, and they come after you with everything, and you have to be strong. And that's why you need to be in an organization. You know, you can't do this alone. It's too much weight. And when you're in an organization and when you are targeted, your people gather around you to defend you emotionally, perhaps financially, and so on. That's the power of a bigger organization. You know, so I can't precisely tell you what the tactics would be, but I can tell you that you should know that there are hundreds of millions of us, and I mean it, hundreds of millions of us, hundreds of millions, and these hundreds of millions will look upon you and the work you're doing in Australia, and they will say they are on the good side of history. And whatever happens, they are fighting the fight against the real bastards, you know, who are cynical, nasty. And I'll tell you, the weakest thread here which I'm going to recommend that you start to pull on, is the arms sales and Australia's relationship to Israel, the West, and so on, in the whole arms trade, in the buying and selling of weapons and intelligence. It's very dangerous for you as a small group to focus on something like Pine Gap. So don't focus on it now. You'll have to focus on it later. When you are stronger, when you have a mass character, that's what you have to take on. Imagine the day when 100,000 Australians march towards Pine Gap to say, shut this down. It is a violation of indigenous land. It continues to rob and steal ancestral burial places and so on. But also it participates in a nasty destabilization of East Asia. It goes against the natural interests of the Australian people, which is to have peaceful relationships with other Asian countries, including China. Why should Australia be home to US nuclear aircraft in that part of in Darwin? Why should the runway be extended so that the United States can actually station nuclear weapons on Australian soil? Australia is a signatory of the Treaty of Rarotonga. The housing of these US nuclear missiles in Australia is a violation of that treaty. I mean, these are the issues which bring everything together. The fact that Australia is going to house US nuclear missiles is reminiscent, Barry, could be reminiscent of the fight for the Pershing missiles coming into the UK and the creation of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Red Ant could be, in a way, the incubator of a new, campaign for nuclear disarmament on the issue of the extension of the airfield in Darwin itself, nothing else, because they are going to house US nuclear missiles. They're saying it's not a violation of the Treaty of Rarotonga because Australia doesn't have the missiles. It's US planes that are going to land there and be hangared there under US command. So in effect, it's not on Australian soil. I mean, it's incredible arguments that you can see already taking place. So you have a lot of work to do, but you can't do any of your work if you remain a small group. That's the main thing I'll tell you guys, Brandon and Nandini. If you remain a small group, you can't do all the things you have to do. You've got to go out there. This is the moment to reach out to the people who are moved through this politics of disgust and repulsion, this politics of heart sickness. You got to bring those people into your process. You don't have to hammer them on the head with, imperialism too quickly, but you got to bring them in, because sensitive people in many parts of the world don't have the experience of being organized. It's been decades since big mass organizations of the left have been available in countries like Australia. So you're going to have to be very patient in building these kinds of formations. They don't just happen like this.
Okay, Vijay, you've spoken to us about imperialism and cricket. I'm very impressed that you managed to do that. Now, look, and also, Vijay, if you can speak this well off the top of your head when you're exhausted, I've seen you first thing in the morning, actually, when you've had your cup of coffee, and that was at the conference in Johannesburg last year. So thank you very much for your contribution. And now I am going to give my presentation on the history of anti-Semitism, a Marxist view of that. And I noticed that you did manage to weave in some of the things that you did read my draft. Hey, good on you. Thanks, mate. Okay, well, look, thank you very much. And on behalf of Red Ant, we do invite you to Australia. And if that means I have to take you to a cricket match, yeah, I'll do it. Okay.
Perth does have the fastest.
Oh, Perth has the fastest wicket, I'm told. Hey, that's cool. Okay. Well, look, okay, look, thank you very much, Vijay. And please, sleep, recover, help to build the revolutionary movement around the world. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Okay, now look, we have not been able to get hold of Zoe Alexandra, who is also in New York. So apologies for those who joined this meeting because of her. Zoe is a young Jewish woman in New York. She's an anti-Zionist activist, and she's part of the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. And so we were looking forward to her contribution. However, following this meeting, I will catch up with her and I'll record an interview with her that we'll put on the Red Ant website. Oh, and if you are interested in joining Red Ant or advancing our campaigns, there is a sign-up sheet just there on that table, and there is other material there. If you want to buy any of our booklets, see me afterwards. So look, I'm going to give a history of anti-Semitism. And this is unashamedly from a Marxist point of view. You'll notice Vijay can speak straight off the top of his head no matter what, but I have to prepare in advance. So I will be reading here. But I did run this past Vijay and get his contributions. So look, in 1843, Marx wrote his book on the Jewish question. And when he wrote that, Germany was ruled by decrepit aristocrats who proclaimed that they ruled on behalf of the Christian religion. The so-called spirit of the state was Christian. So they had all sorts of laws oppressing Jews. So it was an apartheid state. That was all these little princelings were running apartheid states. Now, Marx's book was written in response to another book. It was written by a bloke called Bruno Bauer. And Bruno Bauer at that point was a revolutionary. And Marx debated very sharply with him because Bauer had said in his book that if Jews wanted emancipation, they should first give up their religion. He said that a state can only be secular if everybody is induced to give up their religion. Now, within a couple of years, Bauer moved from radical politics to straight out anti-Semitism. Now, nowadays, the Zionist state of Israel declares that the spirit of its state is Jewish, which is just a mirror image of the oppressive German apartheid states of that time, the kind of state that Marx denounced. Now, the logic of Zionism leads directly to the kind of racist hatred that came to possess Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer grew to hate Jews, and Zionists are possessed by a genocidal hatred of Palestinians. So what Marx argued for was a democratic secular state in which people could express their humanity, including all of its religious and spiritual aspects. So when we call for a democratic secular Palestine, that's something that Red Ant does call for, by the way, that's what we're talking about. That's the content of "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." So today I want to examine how we got into this whole mess of anti-Semitism and Zionism. How did anti-Semitism arise in the first place? What has maintained it over the years? And how did it get intertwined with capitalism? And I say that Zionism actually maintains anti-Semitism. So I'm going to cover 2,000 years of history in approximately 30 minutes, which is about 1.5 minutes per century. So I will be skimming over things. I'm going to be arguing that anti-Semitism, just like Vijay was saying, is a problem of European civilization. It's not a problem of religion, and it's been dumped onto the Palestinian people. And I say that Zionism is a false messiah for the Jewish people, creating disaster. I'm drawing on a variety of sources for this, including a couple of Marx's books, Karl Kautsky's Foundations of Christianity, Abraham Leon's classic work, The Jewish State, Perry Anderson's Passages from Antiquity to Feudalism, The Darkening Age by Catherine Nixie. I recommend all of these readings. And Janie Stone and Donnie Kluckstein's recent and excellent book on the radical Jewish tradition. And there are 10 copies of that here for people to buy if you want to buy one. It's just come out. So let's start with what the Mediterranean world was like 2,000 years ago. The dominant force was the Roman Empire. which Kautsky explains was built on the military prowess of the independent Italian farmers. They were organized into legions and they conquered the world. They were the yeoman farmers. However, the empire's expansion created contradictions that eventually tore it apart. And it was because the military victories brought an endless supply of slaves into Italy. As the slave economy grew, it undermined the economic position of the yeoman farmers and drove them into the cities as proletarians. And slave production itself had its own contradictions that also undermined it. So the urban proletarians had citizenship rights and they demanded bread from the rulers. So the metropolis, Rome, uselessly sucked in resources from the rest of the empire. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels say that the intractable class struggle between the rich and the poor in Rome mutually exhausted both sides and the whole edifice just collapsed. So having undermined the economy of the yeoman farmers, to raise armies, Rome turned to mercenaries like the German Vandals and Goths. They trained these tribes in military technique, and eventually those mercenaries simply just invaded and took over. As Abraham Leon explains, the Jewish people in the Middle East were perfectly placed to succeed as traders because they bridged the Roman, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Chinese empires. So Jews were scattered in the diaspora as traders long before the Jewish revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem. And I'll just give a short description of these Jewish traders. This comes from a Muslim writer, actually, a couple of centuries later, but he said the merchants speak Arabic, Persian, Greek, the language of the Franks, of the Andalusians, and of the Slavs. They journey from west to east and from east to west, partly on land, partly by sea. They take ship in the land of the Franks on the western sea and steer for Egypt. There they load their goods on the backs of camels and travel by land to Kulzum. There they embark into the eastern sea and go to India and China. So the bottom line of all of this is that these people were extremely sophisticated. The Jewish religion was centered in Jerusalem, where the priests dominated and lived corruptly. But in the diaspora, the Jewish sect called the Pharisees built community prayer centers called synagogues, and their theology actually opposed the priesthood. These synagogues were sophisticated and intellectually rich and attracted a large supporter base of non-Jews who were allowed to participate on the fringe of the congregations. And among those fringe groups, who are made up of Greeks, the Jewish food restrictions and circumcision were quite abhorrent. So while there was a large community of non-Jewish sympathizers, there was a barrier to them converting. But then into the synagogues came a new Jewish sect, the Christians. And to put it mildly, they sparked debate. They said Jesus was the Messiah and God had allowed them to eat whatever they wanted and men did not have to get circumcised. Now, at the beginning of each synagogue meeting, the Pharisees would call down blessings from God on the congregation, and then they'd call down curses on the enemies of the congregation. After a while, the Christians got added to the list of people being cursed. And that drove them out of the synagogues. And it led the Christians, as they wrote their Gospels, transposing back into the mouth of Jesus the debates that they were having with the other Jewish groups. Abraham Leon says there was also a class divide in all this. He says, and this is a quote, Christianity in its beginnings must be considered as a reaction of the labouring masses of the Jewish people against the domination of the wealthy commercial classes. Now, all of this squabbling among Jewish sects wouldn't mean anything except that in the year 312, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. So out went Christian radicalism, in came Christian dominion. Christianity blessed the emperor, and the emperor used Christianity as a tool. Perry Anderson says that the rise of Christianity was both a symptom and a cause of the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Christian hierarchy that started being paid by the Roman state added yet another layer of useless bureaucracy to an already bloated state apparatus. But by effectively becoming the police, the Christians brought a whole new ideology to Western civilization, and that is total ignorance. As Catherine Nixie explains, the early church fathers preached and recommended that the masses should remain totally illiterate, and they organised the destruction of libraries and much more. For example, St. Augustine said, all superstition of pagans and heathens should be annihilated. That is what God wants, God commands, God proclaims. So all the statues, all the temples, all the books were attacked, especially books. Christine Nixie estimates that 90% of antique literature went up in flames. All the libraries, the whole lot, and librarians copped it in the neck, literally with swords. So while all of this burning and wrecking was going on, the Goths and the Visigoths invaded. Perry Anderson says that their arrival melded the dying slave economy with Germanic social structures and created feudalism. But both parts of that synthesis were in crisis when they met. So the result was very slow in maturing. That this is what we call the Dark Ages. Under feudalism, the productive working masses, the peasants, were tied to the land and forbidden to travel. There was a social contract. The peasants fed the barons protected the peasants. Nothing was meant to change. God was in his heaven, and on earth, everything was in its place. The prevailing ideology was stasis, and that was blessed by the church. Part of the theology was that usury, lending money for interest, was bad and wrong, because that actually created economic growth. The only proper source of wealth was land, so the barons and kings incessantly warred against each other to expand their holdings. However, what about the Jews? So they not only had another religion, they had books, and they read, and they argued, and they moved around the place trading, and they were very sophisticated. The economy of feudalism was natural and survivalist. Abraham Leon says it produced values, it used values, not exchange values. That is, each village or valley met its own needs. But there was still a need for trade, especially in luxuries. So just as the Dalits, the untouchables in India, got consigned to doing all the socially necessary labour that was outside of the social construct, but everybody condemns them for it, Jews were consigned to a similarly tight niche in European civilization. Jews were allowed to trade, and through that they acquired hordes of money. And when the barons and kings needed cash for their armies, they borrowed from the Jews. When it came time to pay back, they would often denounce those Jews as usurers, kill them, and seize their wealth. And for good measure, they might unleash a pogrom from among the peasantry as well. So from this, you can see how anti-Semitism was constructed and how useful it was for the ruling orders. Janie Stone and Donnie Kluckstein explain how, as capitalism began to slowly crystallize within feudalism, kings would sometimes expel Jews from their realms to stop competition with Christian capitalists. Now, one of the nations that was actually accepting of Jews was Poland. And so most Jews ended up living there. Then Poland got carved up between various empires, and the majority of Jews ended up living under the Russian Tsars. The Tsars strictly constrained Jews to a limited number of occupations and living locations. It essentially trapped them as a middle layer between the sainted Tsar and the peasants. Now, I'll just read a description here of life in the Polish town of Vilna that illustrates how the Tsars set up their realm so that everybody hated each other and had to relate to the Tsar as like the holy arbitrator. So this is the description. Despite several communities living cheek by jowl, there was no melting pot. Each nationality lived a separate life and had no contact with the other. 8 different languages were spoken. Polish stood at 31%, Russian 20%, while Belarusian and Lithuanian were among the others. But Yiddish was easily highest at 40%. These proportions were reversed outside the city precincts. Yiddish speakers were 4%, whereas Russian constituted 44%, Ukrainian 18%, and so on. So it was like the Tsarist society was set up like a pressure cooker, with the peasantry having an enormous number of resentments. But the people they were directed to resenting were these Jewish traders in the towns. So within this ghettoized existence, there were also class differentiations between rich Jews who liaised with outside authorities and poorer Jews. And this is a recurrent feature all the way up to the Zionist behaviour in World War II. Now, Janie Stone and Donnie Kluckstein show that where the bourgeoisie took up its historical role of waging democratic revolution against feudalism, Jewish emancipation advanced. Revolutions were good for Jews. Those capitalist revolutions occurred because capitalism is based on commodity production for profit, not use values. So money hoards, which the traders had, changed into capital, and capital needs freedom to chase profit. And workers need freedom to sell their labour power. So the human beings who personify both capital and labour power need freedom, and that gives us bourgeois democracy. Where the bourgeoisie chickened out of its revolutionary role, especially in Germany and in Tsarist Russia, Jews suffered. Now, so revolutions were good for Jews, counter-revolutions were bad. And today Zionism is clearly a counter-revolutionary force. Within Tsarist Russia, Jews suffered as capitalism emerged because, as Isaac Deutscher pointed out, they were, quote, the main primitive agent of the money economy. And as the incoming capitalist money economy smashed feudal life, those on the receiving end struck out blindly at what they experienced as the cause. From all of this, Jews in the lower classes drew revolutionary conclusions and became leaders of revolutionary movements. And that tradition extended into the rise of the revolutionary communist movement. Many of the leaders of the Bolshevik Party were Jews. So Janie Stone and Donnie Kluckstein say that many Jews became communists or members of the Bund, which was a politically centrist organisation, a socialist organisation. The Bund organised armed resistance to pogroms within the Tsarist Empire, some of which had very significant successes. So Jews were not like passive victims of anti-Semitism. The socialist Jews led resistance to that. But there were other political trends within the Jewish community that did not organise resistance. For example, the conservative rabbis wanted to control the population, and they would do anything possible to not upset anti-Semitic authorities. And those Orthodox conservatives opposed any idea of moving to Palestine and establishing a Jewish state. They said that could only happen after the Messiah comes. So this actually gives the lie to the Zionist claim that establishing Israel fulfills centuries of prophecy. In fact, the creation of Israel broke with centuries of religious teaching. Another competing trend was bourgeois assimilationism. Rich Jews found it convenient to simply adopt the prevailing language and culture. Assimilationism was strongest where emancipation was best established, which was in Western Europe. Assimilationist Jews came to see their lower class co-religious as an embarrassment. Assimilationists adjusted themselves to the prevailing racism of their capitalist societies. So, for example, the British Board of Deputies did not oppose the 1905 Aliens Act, which was designed explicitly to exclude Jews from entering Britain. The last trend was Zionism, which was established by Theodor Herzl, and it had the least support of all of the political trends within the community, the Jewish community. Isaac Deutscher noted, and Isaac Deutscher actually was in Poland during a lot of these debates. He noted that the Jewish community elections that were held regularly in Poland up to World War II, in those elections, the Zionists never once won a majority. The overwhelming majority voted for the Bund or for communists. But what Zionism lacked in grassroots support, it made up for in networks with the great and the powerful. Theodor Herzl made it his business to reach out to the most anti-Semitic political figures and offer them the service of extracting Jews from their societies. Herzl described all progressive thinking, he despised all progressive thinking. He said, this is a quote, "Universal brotherhood is not even a beautiful dream." Now, following his death, his followers reached out to the anti-Semite Lord Arthur Balfour, the man who was responsible for the 1905 Aliens Act, and he declared British support for the Zionist homeland in Palestine. Now, there are a couple of reasons for Balfour's declaration. One reason was, as he put it, this is a quote from a letter he wrote, it was to mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body which it too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or to absorb. I mean, could you get a better mouthful of anti-Semitism than that? Stone and Kluckstein say that the Balfour Declaration was also, they say, a cynical decision of an embattled imperialism desperate for allies. Balfour was hoping that the Zionists in the USA would push the USA into World War I. Now, Britain double-crossed everyone. Besides the 1916 Balfour Declaration, they offered Palestine to the Arabs in 1915 and as a joint administration to the French in 1916. In a letter to the British Prime Minister, Balfour said, "The weak point of our position, of course, is that in the case of Palestine, we deliberately and rightly decline to accept the principle of self-determination. We do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country, the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land." Now, in 1917, there was another event, the Russian Revolution. That revolution swept away all anti-Semitic laws in Russia. Within a few weeks, the revolution achieved more than what the Zionists and other trends and other conservatives had ever achieved anywhere. It gave the total lie to the Zionist claim that non-Jews will always hate and oppress Jews. Now, I won't go into the rest of the history of the Russian Revolution. There's a lot to be said. And I won't go into the history of Zionist expansion into Palestine either. But what is important is the relationship between the bourgeois Zionists and imperialism and how willing the Zionists were to betray their co-religious. Now, as is well known, in the 1920s, Germany was gripped by a series of revolutionary waves and the growth of a mass communist party. The German bourgeoisie found it convenient to unleash the Nazis onto the leftists. Nazi propaganda always identified communists as Judeo-Bolsheviks. They also channeled mass discontent with capitalism into hatred of Jewish capitalists. So the German bourgeoisie happily threw their Jewish comrades to the wolves. But there was a lot of throwing people to the wolves going on. An example of what occurred immediately, an example of that throwing people to the wolves occurred immediately after Hitler took power. There was a worldwide boycott of German goods. There was a kind of like a BDS, like we have today. A slogan of that boycott was, The boycott is the moral substitute for war. But the World Zionist Organization deliberately undermined the boycott by cutting a deal with the Nazis. It was called the Transfer Agreement. It allowed 60,000 Jews to move to Palestine as part of the Zionist project. They had to buy their way out of Germany, so poor and left-wing Jews were sacrificed. Now, ironically, as Nathaniel Flaken relates in his biography of the immortal Jewish communist resistance fighter, Martin Monath, the agreement allowed Zionist organizations to actually function legally in Nazi Germany all the way up to Kristallnacht in 1938, while leaving left-wing organizations to be smashed. So Yiddish language newspapers were imported legally from Poland, and the Nazi authorities couldn't read that. So the police would visit Zionist meetings and not notice that Martin Monath, the communist, was reading the writings of Leon Trotsky in Yiddish to the youth. Now, Monath went on to a heroic career operating underground in occupied France. He produced a German language newspaper directed at German soldiers, and he recruited many. If you look into the history of that, it is an amazing history and truly inspiring. Unfortunately, now he was martyred by the SS just before the liberation of Paris. Now, the Zionists cannot point to similar heroes because their record was horribly different. Perhaps the worst example of collaboration was that of rounding up an extermination of the Hungarian Jews in 1944. At that point, the war was clearly coming to an end, but the Nazis were still intent on their genocide. Hitler's favourite henchman, Adolf Eichmann, was in charge of Hungary, and he had an underling called Kurt Becker, or Becher, who was organising the shipping out of Jews. Now, Becher had honed his skills on the Eastern Front, where he slaughtered Jews with machine guns and special mobile gas trucks. Now, his first job in Hungary was to shake down Jewish capitalists for money. He was known to have suitcases full of loot. Now, given the balance of forces in the war, how could he get the Jewish community onto transport trains without sparking a revolt? He worked with a leader of the Hungarian Zionists, a guy called Retzo Kaczner. Becher allowed Kaczner to organize around 1,700 bourgeois Jews to leave Hungary by train and go to Palestine in return for copious bribes. Kaczner knew very well about the gas chambers. He enjoyed night clubbing with the Nazi occupiers. He was eating and drinking the best while other Jews starved. He was a total collaborator. Now, Kaczner's role was to run around Hungary telling ordinary Jews that it was safe to get on the Nazi trains. He said they were going to work in factories. But on his train, there were wealthy Jews, Zionist leaders, prominent rabbis, and Kaczner's friends and family. He even organised for the Nazis to go along his train and carefully vet who was on there. And a couple of people who'd snuck on, who weren't on the list, a couple of Jews trying to escape, no, they were physically thrown off the train. So the Nazi leader, Becher, was able to peacefully vacuum up about 700,000 Hungarian Jews in a matter of weeks. The vast number of transported Hungarian Jews overwhelmed the capacity of the gas chambers. Now, Art Spiegelman, in his graphic memoir, Mouse, A Survivor's Tale, recounts his Polish father telling him what happened next. His father was in Auschwitz. Those what finished in the gas chambers before they got pushed in those graves, it was the lucky ones. The others had to jump in the graves while they were still alive. Prisoners what worked there poured gasoline over the live ones and the dead ones, and the fat from the burning bodies they scooped and poured again so everyone could burn better. Okay, Betcher, he was tried for war crimes at Nuremberg, but he got off scot-free. That was because Retzo Katzner rushed to Nuremberg to defend him. Katzner told the court, Betcher belongs to the, this is a quote, Betcher belongs to the very few SS leaders having the courage to oppose the program of annihilation of the Jews and trying to rescue human lives. Betcher went on after the war to become a successful businessman in West Germany. And he even advised Chancellor Kohl. And it appears that he used his stash of looted wealth as his grub stake for setting up his business. What happened to Katzner afterwards demonstrates Zionism's absolute viciousness and hypocrisy, because in the 1950s in Israel, he became the spokesperson for the Israeli Ministry of Trade. However, one of the Hungarian Jews who he had betrayed, who had managed to survive, denounced him publicly as a collaborator. And the Israeli government sued that person for defamation on behalf of Katzner, right? So this is the Zionist state suing, taking a death camp survivor to court in defense of a collaborator. In his defense, Katzner said that betraying the Hungarian Jews was acceptable because they had assimilated into Hungarian culture. They weren't talking Yiddish, they weren't talking Hebrew, they were talking Hungarian. He said, quote, the Hungarian Jew was a branch of Judaism which long ago dried up on the tree. So he meant that because Hungarian Jews were assimilated, they could not be expected to resist and they were not worthy to be saved. And okay, in the first court hearing, he was found guilty. However, the Israeli Supreme Court on appeal said that, yes, he was guilty of collaboration with the Nazis, but they overturned
cannot speak at Universitas something in Surabaya, but online.
Max, you have to go on mute, mate. I can hear your voice. Okay. So while he was guilty of collaboration with the Nazis, they overturned the part of the victory, the verdict, that found that sending Hungarian Jews to their deaths was wrong. Now, the point of all this, I say, is that Israel is not a safe haven for Jews. It's only a safe haven for Zionists. From Retzo Katzner's train to the Israeli helicopters who slaughtered Israeli citizens on October the 7th, Zionism is utterly cynical. So in conclusion, comrades, I want to reiterate that Zionism is a false messiah for the Jewish people. And that expression I take from the title of Nathan Weinstock's very good history of Zionism. It's called Zionism False Messiah. But my last words I'll take from Abram Leon, and I'll interpose my thoughts in what he wrote. Now, remember that he wrote this under German occupation at the very worst point of World War II, when the Nazis were inflicting anti-Semitism on all of Europe. He was a leader of the Belgian communist resistance to the Nazis, and he died in one of the Nazi death camps as well. So Abram Leon said, never has the situation of the Jews been so tragic. Now, I say the situation of the Palestinians today is tragic, but so is the situation of the Jews caught in the false consciousness of Zionism. I say it leads to madness. Abram Leon, in the worst periods of the Middle Ages, entire countries opened their doors to receive them. Today, capitalism, which rules the world, makes the earth uninhabitable for them. That applies to the Palestinians today. There are 5 million stateless Palestinians in the world today. Abram Leon. Never has the mirage of a promised land so haunted the Jewish people. but never was a promised land less capable of resolving the Jewish question than in our time. And I say that that is as equally true today as it was when Abraham Leon wrote it back in the 1940s. So thank you. Should we have some Q&A?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
All righty. So do we have any questions now? Or discussion points? None here? Me in the chats, there's some stuff in the chat. Oh, sounds like something happened in Brooklyn and yeah, concerns about Zoe here.
Oh God.
Violent, unprovoked police attack tonight in our International Women's Day demonstration in Brooklyn. People were marching peacefully and demanding an end to the genocide in Gaza. More than 20 arrested in this police assault. We won't stop. Maybe why Zoe not available? Yeah, okay, that's not good. Comments or discussion points? I can't see any online at the moment. Yeah.
Thanks, Mary. That's great. I'm reading a book put together by a selection of texts put together by some title of which relates quite closely to your presentation because of all the different arguments made by Jewish people against Zionism. Title of which is Anti-Zionism is Jewish. Sorry, it's in French, so I'm struggling to translate, but it's Anti-Zionism, a Jewish affair, Jewish history, and I think it's probably related to what Vijay was saying. We get caught up as non-Jewish person to this discussion, when in fact all these arguments have been made by Jewish people from the get-go, and we get all tangled into that because of the Holocaust. But the anti-Zionist project, or the Zionist project and its reaction, is a very Jewish debate that has been boiling for a long time. And even now we see that there are plenty of smaller Jewish movements that exist in the Zionist project. But yeah, it's interesting to see how it evolved. And when you read those texts and symbols, like that's what you've been doing, it's surprising to read things from late 19th century and you can verbatim put them into today. And there's it's so strange. And I've never heard of all the kind of like the backflips and stuff that have been done by I had heard, but not in so much detail. That way just presented, but it's interesting to see that the tactics haven't changed either.
Yeah, it's a great pity that Zoe couldn't make her presentation because she was going to talk about the Christian fundamentalist Zionist groups in the United States. And I deliberately included in my, I was going to be speaking first, and I deliberately included all that stuff about the deliberate manufacture of ignorance at the beginning of the establishment of the Christian church, because that feeds directly on what's going on in these churches in the United States. They propound ignorance. They want people to be stupid with guns in their hands.
That was also Scott Morrison's plan.
Yeah, that was Scott Morrison's plan. And I would also say that it's Peter Dutton's plan for Australia. They want to keep us stupid and pig ignorant, and they want to kill culture. What's happening to the university campuses here in Perth right now? What's happened at University of Western Australia? They've abolished social studies, right? Out went the whole school. Anthropology? No. We don't want to know what's happened. We don't want to have relations with Aboriginal people. God, no. What's come in? Strategic studies. What's that connected with? The nuclear power base, the submarine base that's going to be established right here on Garden Island. So what does that mean? It means that our entire culture is being dumbed down and militarized.
But we definitely have a lot in our youth, because they're the ones who are standing up and counteracting this stupidity. So we've got to be there supporting them as well.
And the other thing too is the depth and breadth of the anti-Zionist mobilization among Jewish youth in the United States. I've been showing the film Israelism a couple of times, and it is truly inspiring. The courage, the moral courage of those American youth And it is just beautiful and inspiring, the stand that they are taking.
Any more closing comments or discussion points?
It's interesting that Vijay said that anti-nuclear, like, you know, going that angle would be the best for everyone to go. Because that is true, that sort of talking about like forceful, the gun toting, dumb kind of vision that everyone doing the small, gentle, considering, you know, all of the politics of
Republican discussed.
and yet another word, right? Discussing politics. Yeah. But yeah, that's that gentler, softer, how we can kind of keep that going, and that will obviously in the long run make some sort of inroads.
We've got a bunch of young comrades over east who are, you know, opposing and blockading the ships too, which is fantastic to see online. Exactly where it was, but brilliant.
We got a couple of people here. So, Shin, if you want to speak, unmute and speak now.
Yeah. Thank you. I hope this is sufficiently.
You'll have to get closer to your microphone, Shin. We can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear now? Can you hear it now? Hang on a minute.
Bit louder.
Yeah, you're going to have to get a lot closer.
Okay, sorry, can you hear it now?
Yep, perfect.
Oh, hi. Yep, can you hear?
Yep, and we can see.
Oh, thank you. I'm just curious, in your view, like how important is the debate between one and two states, the one state solution and the two state solution? And is being anti-Zionist necessarily, does that necessarily mean being only for the one state solution? Like, is there, like, does being anti-Zionist necessarily mean that you support the one state solution and not the two state solution?
Oh, well, I'll speak to that. And
Thank you.
no, what solution comes out of this in the end, we can't predict. And really, it's really a discussion for all of those people who have either a religious nostalgic connection to what we generally call the Holy Land, or people who have a connection through birth, you know, going back centuries. And if all of those people have an interest and a commitment to living there, they are the ones who really need to sort it out. And whether it's a one state solution or a two state solution is for them. But personally, I most certainly support the idea of a democratic secular Palestine from the river to the sea. And I can't see how it could be arranged in any other way. Yeah, in the same way that I support a completely unified democratic secular Ireland. You know, there's you know, a terrible history of racist apartheid or apartheid based on the religious difference in Northern Ireland, and yeah, that has to be overcome. And human beings can overcome these things. Where it has, you know, when I don't particularly celebrate the collapse of East Germany, but when Germany was reunified, all the citizens of East Germany were not massacred. It is possible for people to realign state borders and live together.
So my understanding of anti-Zionism is that it's against the continued existence of Israel. So if it was a two-state solution, that would mean Israel continuing as a Zionist entity, I would assume. So
Well,
does
true enough.
anti-Zionism mean one-state solution necessarily?
maybe Israel could re-establish itself as a democratic secular state, and nobody would have to worry about any of this stuff. You know, it's
Yeah, but then why would there be a need for the borders for a separate? If it was democratic, why would there be a need for a separate Palestinian state? Why can't it be just one democracy?
Quite true.
Because everybody seems to, I mean, both sides seem to want the one state from the river to the sea. So yeah, I'm just curious because, you know, Western governments like to talk about the two-state solution a lot.
Yeah, which actually gives a clue to how realistic it is. Maybe we go to, is it Sam wants to speak, or Pippin?
A couple of points, I suppose. One is, I mean, I think it's a useful discussion that we're having, and I don't feel like this is just getting caught in the weeds or, I suppose, being too defensive or something like that, as I think, you know, Vijay was suggesting in his comments as to, you know, what kind of discussions are useful. One of the reasons that I think it's important, I mean, I guess the initiative for this came from Perth. We're here in Melbourne, but looking at what happened with the way that the false claim of anti-Semitism was used to fight against the left wing of the Labor Party in the UK, and basically you know, was central, I think, to the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn. You know, that seemed to be a very powerful weapon, and I think quite instructive, because in some ways very instructive perhaps because it didn't seem from this distance that those false charges were adequately addressed, and the response of the Corbyn leadership, I think, was to basically, how do you put it? In my mind, I've got the word capitulate, but sort of, you know, they adopted the formal definition of anti-Semitism basically as, what's the institution, you know, as recommended by the Zionists, and just gave so much ground to that argument, which was an obviously false argument given Corbyn's history and so on. And in doing so, seemed to allow the waters to just remain really muddied on the issue. I mean, it's in so many ways far clearer now because of the actions of the Israeli state, you know, over the last several months. It wasn't, you know, consciousness was not anywhere similar then to what it is now. So that made, I guess, you know, that issue harder to address at the time, or for the left to address. But it seemed to me that that kind of capitulation and lack of clarity was actually a defense, whereas I guess I feel that us discussing the ideas and trying to deepen our understanding and increase basically our clarity around these arguments is actually a way to get on the front foot in terms of winning people over and, you know, winning the debates that ultimately, yes, we need to have, you know, more broadly and with as many people as possible. The other point I wanted to make is, and I think this is similar to a point that Barry made in his talk, so perhaps I'm just reiterating it or expressing it differently, but it seems to me a very clear absurdity of this, this charge of anti-Semitism is that it's obvious that the colonial project, you know, the Israeli state project, is going to endanger Jewish people, because it conflates, you know, just the nature of conflating the oppressive actions of Israel with the Jewish religion obviously creates a social basis for people. You're saying this is to defend the Jews and you're bombing people. Like, obviously that's going to turn some people who don't understand fully the, you know, the hypocrisy of it, or the, you know, who don't have a full understanding of like the imperial background to the Israeli state and so on. it's a basis of creation of anti-Semitism in the future. So, okay, we can see, and the talks outline how anti-Semitism is a European, in its historical origin. But it seems that the Israeli project is surely the #1 incubator of anti-Semitism into the future. And how can it be possible to have a peaceful, safe existence for all the Jewish people while the Israeli state still exists as it does?
I think the big argument to use, or the thing that we need to sharpen ourselves up on, is the role of collaboration of Zionism with imperialism. I only gave one example of Zionist collaboration with the Nazis in World War II. I actually edited out another 2 examples from my talk. But that collaboration exists today. It's Zionist, the Zionist state of Israel is totally entwined with the imperialist project of the United States. So we need to get clear on what is the nature of imperialism today, so that we can actually locate the role of Israel within that. Otherwise, people can just get confused about, oh, geez, so Jews are bombing Muslims? What's going on here? No, it's not Jews bombing Muslims. It's this is the dirty work of imperialism. So we have to become we have to forever be sharpening our skills of debate to explain the nature of imperialism today. That's my take-home message in response to what you just said, Sam. And so, Andy?
I think a response to this forum by many progressive people on the left isn't that just self-evident? Isn't it very clear that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism? But that's clearly not the case when you look at the viewpoint of ruling institutions and even the liberal milieu that you come across in today's society. And what makes the issue confusing is the legacy of Australian imperialism does make it confusing. That you have a state that's predominantly white, the Anglican religion as well, has played a role in the social psychology of this country, in that the religious beliefs that were fostered was that, yes, Jewish people have a right to what was supposedly their land. Like, I was raised in a millenarian cult, and it was just a part of the psychology of growing up, was this belief. It was a spiritual belief that Jewish people were entitled to Israel, and it's a legacy that remains in Australian society. So even if that's not expressed geopolitically, it's still a belief that people hold, even if it's quite a latent belief. It's not something that's clearly conscious. So, but it's part of the grain of our society that we have to struggle against. So yeah, it's not absolutely clear to everyone the issues in dispute in the Middle East. And when we have to fight against apathy as well, that's probably our biggest enemy. But for the ruling institutions of our society, it's very clear as to what side they're on. If you look at Congress in November, they actually put forward a resolution which says the House clearly and firmly states anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And it's interesting to look at the vote there. Only 3% of Congress voted against that. 3%. That was 14 members of Congress voted against. So yeah, 311 voted for, and there were 92 abstentions, which is obviously the Democrats, who just don't, obviously this issue is just too hot for them. But it is going to split them in a big way, because there's a clear tension between what's happening despite the social psychology of US imperialism and settler colonial states, the horror of what Israel has done is impacting people's consciousness. There's no doubt about that. And I think that's coming in some opinion polls, which we don't really have in Australia, but in the US, there's something like 70% of people support a ceasefire. It'd be interesting to see what that figure was here. And the issue becomes clearer the more people analyse it, the more, and that's our role to organise and propagandise against imperialism. But it becomes clear when people look at the rhetoric of Netanyahu, and you really can see that they've absorbed the language and methods that the Nazis have used. And like Netanyahu holding up a map of Greater Israel that has the Golan Heights, has parts of Lebanon, Syria, etc., and saying, well, this is the river to the sea. This is, very clearly what the conflict is about. That it is about land. My question, I guess, would be to the panel how they think the US elections are going to play out with this issue. I mean, the vote of 100,000 not committed, I think, is a good signifier of unrest. I mean, I suppose, yeah, you can't really tell, but I mean, the language being used by Democrats is like they're really attacking people like Rashida Tlaib, saying that she's going to hand the election to Trump. And I wonder, Barry, if you have any thoughts about it.
I was around when Lyndon Baines Johnson was president of the United States, and we used to chant, hey, LBJ, how many kids do you kill today? And that chant has revived in the pro-Palestine rallies of late, which I think is absolutely brilliant. I think it's great. LBJ's attempt to run for a second term of president in 1968 was smashed by the anti-war movement. And then, of course, Richard Nixon won, and he talked peace, but he waged war. And you could say, oh God, that's a setback for the whole movement. But in fact, the movement kept fighting, and it was that movement that produced the wave that ultimately drove Richard Nixon out of the presidency. So my reading of the American elections that's coming, Biden's going to get smashed. Biden's a heap of shit, and Biden deserves to be smashed. Goddamn. And Trump does not deserve to win. However, I believe that Trump. I believe that Trump is going to win, but I believe that the mass movement in the United States is taking on the kind of dimensions that is required to undermine the Trump presidency and ultimately bring him down. Now, I can't make any further predictions about that than that. There was something else that you said there that I really wanted to respond to.
Together those four comments. Yeah. I don't think you're right.
Oh, and on the floor here, I'm being challenged. I'm being told that no, I'm not quite right. Yeah, Mick here has been following the Republican primary debates between the various candidates, and those candidates all they competed with each other to demonstrate how bullish they were on supporting Israel's attacks on the Palestinians. And Mick's feeling is that the uncommitted voters may not break from the Democrats and go to Trump, and I agree with that. And also, he started his comments by saying the anti-Vietnam War movement in the United States grew and won because of the number of American soldiers who were dying in Vietnam, and that fed the outrage, which is absolutely true. And my reading of the situation in the United States is, I think the uncommitted voters are not going to vote for Biden. I think they're utterly revolted. They may vote for a third candidate, or they may not vote at all. And I think that Trump is going to win. And all of us here will be moved to the pit of our stomachs by either Trump or Biden winning. We know that. We don't have any, there's no love lost for either candidate. So it really comes down to, we have to build the independent movement. It really has, it has come down to, in the United States especially, we cannot play the game of lesser evilism. It's just got to the point where we can't. Oh, and I just wanted to go back to something that Andy said about this business that really among progressives, we know this question of is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic, we know damn well it's rubbish. I mean, I handed one of my leaflets to a good friend of mine, and he said, oh yeah, the Zionists, they're just taking the piss, you know, and it's true, that's all they're doing. However, it was precisely this campaign that smashed up Jeremy Corbyn's campaign in Britain. And that was the most important, the nearest we have got to a genuinely socialist left-wing break within the Labour movement, either in Britain or in Australia. And for decades, I can't remember an event like that. And it was he was smashed precisely by using this argument. So it's something that we have to be aware of, and we have to be able to debate. And so, comrades, given that we are now all armed for this debate, I suggest that we go forth and make a difference. Now, please remember, contact list up there on the table. Put your names down for being contacted for future events, and the Leninism Today forums, which are beginning in April. Put your names down. I will contact you about those events. They will be online, and those are the sorts of discussions where we will be thrashing out this question, in particular, of imperialism today. Is imperialism today characterized by what is called sub-imperialisms? Yeah. Is South Africa an imperialist state? Is Russia an imperialist state? Is China an imperialist state? How do we compare those to US imperialism? So these are things that we need to think about and be sharp about. So with that, comrades, I bid you all red salute.